Hello, and welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here, and I truly appreciate you listening today. If you enjoy the stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's settle in and enjoy today's stories. Living deep in the Appalachian Mountains has a way of shaping you. My grandmother, raised in these hills, was always filled with stories about the forest. Warnings, really. The most persistent one was simple. Never leave the window curtains open after dark. She'd say it in a soft, measured tone, her eyes clouding over with a memory she wouldn't share. "What you can't see you," she'd whisper. That night, I was alone in the cabin. My parents had gone down to town, leaving me with just the thick forest and the wind tapping the branches against the windows. I felt a strange compulsion to defy her rule. What could possibly happen just by looking out my own window? At dusk, I did it. I lifted the curtain just a sliver and peered out. The trees were shadowed in twilight, blending into a wall of darkness. Nothing moved, but as I was about to pull the curtain closed, something shifted between the trees. Just a shape, almost human, but not quite. It stood there, rooted like one of the trees, but watching. I closed the curtain so quickly, I stumbled back. My heart pounded, and a strange feeling crept over me, like I'd done something terribly wrong. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the fading light, but I couldn't shake the sensation that it was still out there, waiting. That night, the forest was louder than usual, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, almost as if something was pacing just beyond the walls of the cabin. I tried to sleep, but felt pinned under an unshakable sense of dread. When I finally drifted off, I had vivid dreams of something clawing at the edge of the forest, unseen, but inching closer with every blink of my eyes. Around midnight, I jolted awake to the sound of something scratching, soft but persistent, against my window. I kept the curtains shut, repeating my grandmother's words like a mantra. "What you can't see you." The next morning, I went to see my grandmother. Her face turned serious when I told her about the scratching, and she took my hand, squeezing it with a strength I didn't expect. She told me about a creature the townsfolk called the Hollow Man. They say he'd been here as long as the mountains, a shadow that appears when people look too long into the woods or forget to close their curtains. "He's patient," she warned, "and will wait just outside, watching until curiosity draws you back to the window." The next night, I kept the curtains closed tight and tried not to think about the Hollow Man. But the sounds began again, louder this time. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, circled the cabin, pausing outside each window as if listening. I could feel his presence pressing against the walls, a silent watcher biding his time. Every instinct told me to peek out, to see if he was really there. But I remembered my grandmother's words. I stayed in bed, gripping the blanket until my fingers hurt, repeating to myself, "Don't look, don't let him in." A few days passed, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I avoided looking out after dark, but it wore on me, like a dark itch just beneath the skin. And then, one night, I broke. I couldn't help myself. Just a quick peek, I thought, to prove to myself it was all in my head. I lifted the edge of the curtain, and there he was, tall and thin, standing motionless at the tree line. His face was obscured, but I felt his gaze, cold and piercing, fixed directly on me. I dropped the curtain, heart racing, feeling like I'd invited something ancient and wrong into my life. That night, he was closer. I could feel his presence pressing in, pushing at the edges of the walls. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. My grandmother's warning rang in my ears. Once you see him, he'll follow. He'll wait, always just out of sight. The sounds outside grew louder, almost taunting. Every creak and groan felt like a whisper in my ear, daring me to look, to confirm he was real. But I knew better. Looking would mean inviting him closer, letting him into my world. Days later, a visitor from town arrived, asking about strange happenings around my cabin. The townsfolk had seen him too, a figure in the trees, watching the windows. My visitor warned me about a woman who had once lived nearby, and out of curiosity, looked at the figure too many times. She disappeared without a trace, her cabin found abandoned, her windows all wide open. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, felt like a finger tracing along the walls, seeking a way inside. He was waiting for me to look again, and I felt my will slipping, a dreadful curiosity gnawing at me. But I knew that one more look would be my last. I stayed in the center of the room, back to the windows, clutching my grandmother's old necklace like a lifeline, repeating her words, hoping they'd protect me. But I knew that this thing was patient. It would wait as long as it took. One night, as the moon rose over the mountains, I felt a calm wash over me. I knew I'd have to leave, or be swallowed by his presence forever. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced one last time toward the forest. And there, at the edge of the trees, he stood, silent, waiting, as he always had been. I turned away, never looking back, feeling his gaze on me until the cabin disappeared into the shadows. And as I walked down the mountain, my grandmother's words lingered in my mind. What you can't see you. Some say the hollow man still waits in those woods, drawn to the ones who dare look too long into the trees. I don't go back to that cabin, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering if he's still there, still watching. Growing up, I thought it was normal for Grandpa to sit out on the porch every night, his shotgun resting on his lap, his eyes fixed on the edge of the tree line. He'd sit there from dusk until dawn, scanning the woods, barely moving except to sip his coffee. I never understood it. When I asked him why, he'd only mutter, "It's my job to keep them out." As I got older, the mystery gnawed at me. There was something he wasn't saying, something that seemed to darken his gaze every time the sun went down. One summer night, I couldn't sleep and crept out onto the porch to sit with him. His face was stern, his eyes never leaving the trees. I asked him again why he did it, why he sat out here night after night. This time, he answered, "There's things in those woods, things that don't belong in our world. They come close at night, hoping to slip in while the rest of the world sleeps." He paused, his grip tightening on the gun. "Someone has to make sure they don't." I laughed nervously, but his expression stayed grave. "Go back inside, and don't open a curtain or door until morning." Curiosity got the better of me. The next night, I kept my bedroom window open just a crack and peered out at him, sitting like a stone on the porch. Midnight crept closer, and everything was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, something moved along the edge of the woods. A shape, thin, too tall to be any animal I knew, hovered just at the tree line, barely visible. It shifted, stretching one elongated arm toward the porch, its form dark against the moonlight. I froze, heart racing, unable to look away. Suddenly, Grandpa raised the gun, aiming it straight into the darkness. He didn't fire, but the figure stopped, melting back into the shadows. The next morning, Grandpa didn't say a word about the night's events, but the air was heavier, as though something unspoken clung between us. I asked him about the figure in the woods, but he only shook his head. Once they know you've seen them, they get bolder. That night, I stayed inside as he sat on the porch, the shotgun gleaming in his hands. I lay in bed, too afraid to sleep, listening to the silence, every little noise magnified in my mind. But the worst part was the silence that would settle, heavy and tense, as though the whole forest held its breath. Days later, I cornered my dad and asked him about Grandpa's habit. Dad's face went pale, and he looked away, his voice dropping to a murmur. He's been out there every night since your uncle disappeared. I'd never known my uncle, who had vanished as a teenager, lost in the woods one evening. No one had seen him again, but Grandpa never stopped looking, and when he couldn't find him, he took to watching the woods instead, guarding the rest of us from something. The next night, curiosity got the better of me again, and I crept out to the porch. Grandpa was sitting there, shotgun in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line, with a look that sent a chill down my spine. "Thought I told you to stay inside," he said, barely glancing at me. "I saw it," I replied. "The thing in the woods." His face darkened. "They're not things. They're shadows of what once was. Some say they're lost souls. Others say they're something older, something that never was human." He motioned for me to sit, and I could feel a strange mix of fear and respect as I took a spot beside him. Hours passed in silence, and the night grew colder. I was drifting off when Grandpa's hand tightened around the gun. "Stay still," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the woods. A figure had stepped out from the tree line, the same tall, twisted shape I'd seen before. It stood there, swaying as if caught between worlds. I felt a pull, an urge to stand up, to walk toward it. But Grandpa grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and the figure paused, retreating back into the shadows. "They want you to come to them," he said, his voice barely audible. "Once you do, they won't let you go." The next night was different. More shadows gathered at the tree line, their shapes more distinct, their forms somehow darker, more solid. Grandpa didn't seem surprised. He just sat there, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the figures. For the first time, he spoke to them, his voice a low, firm murmur. "You don't belong here. You'll get nothing from me." They shifted, their outlines blurring, and I thought I saw faces, pale, ghostly, twisted in expressions of sorrow and hunger. One of them took a step forward, a bony arm reaching toward us, its fingers long and thin. Grandpa lifted the shotgun, a warning that made them pause. They stared for a moment longer, then melted back into the forest, leaving us in silence once more. Over the following days, Grandpa seemed more tense, as though the barrier between our world and theirs was thinning. "They're getting bolder," he muttered one morning. "Used to be, they'd just watch. Now they're testing the line." He told me of old superstitions, rituals people once used to keep the shadows at bay, little charms and talismans that lined our cabin's walls. He instructed me to place salt along every door and window, to mark the boundary between us and them. But he didn't explain why they were drawn to this place, or what they wanted. One night, I noticed a new figure among the shadows, a smaller, familiar form. My heart pounded as I recognized him, my uncle, or at least a twisted version of him. His eyes glowed with a cold, otherworldly light, and he moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, his gaze fixed on Grandpa. Grandpa's face softened, a sorrowful look crossing his eyes. For a moment, he seemed to weaken, lowering the gun slightly. But then he stiffened, shaking his head, and whispered, "It's not him. It's never him." The figure disappeared, leaving behind an aching silence, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time it tried to return. Grandpa's vigil had become more intense, his resolve more desperate. He hadn't slept in days, and I could see the toll it was taking. That night, he handed me the shotgun. "If they come for me, you take my place," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Someone has to keep them out." As dawn approached, the figures came closer, circling the porch, reaching toward the light as though testing its strength. Grandpa stood between them and the door, unflinching, his gaze never wavering. With the first light of dawn, the shadows dissolved, retreating to the safety of the woods. But I knew, as did he, that they'd be back. When Grandpa passed a few years later, the cabin felt empty, yet I could feel his presence, as though he still sat on that porch every night, keeping watch. And now, it was my turn. Each night, I take his seat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, my eyes on the tree line. I don't know what they are, or what they want, but I know they're out there, watching and waiting, bound by some ancient silent pact. And like him, I'll keep the shadows at bay. When I inherited my grandmother's cabin deep in the Appalachians, everyone around town warned me of her strict ways. She always kept the curtains closed, right at sunset, an old neighbor told me, her voice hushed. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just one of those mountain superstitions. But there was something unsettling about the way she would say it, like she knew something I didn't. I settled in quickly, enjoying the peace and isolation. But every evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, I felt a chill creeping through the cabin. I could never shake the feeling that somehow I wasn't alone. The first night I spent in the cabin, I left the curtains open. The trees swayed in the moonlight, casting shadows that crawled across the walls. It was almost hypnotic, watching them shift and sway, until I started to see shapes that didn't belong, dark outlines moving along the tree line, edging closer, and then disappearing back into the woods. I shook it off as a trick of the light, closed the curtains, and climbed into bed. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, the words of my grandmother echoing in my mind. Don't leave them open after dark. You don't know what might be watching. The next day, I went into town and ended up speaking to Miss Ethel, a local with a reputation for knowing every secret these mountains held. When I mentioned my grandmother's rule about the curtains, Ethel grew quiet, her eyes sharp and fearful. "They don't like to be seen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed nervously, but she didn't crack a smile. "You laugh now, but you'll see. They don't like to be seen, especially if you're watching them." She wouldn't say who they were, only that I needed to follow my grandmother's rule. I went home that evening with her warning gnawing at the back of my mind. The second night, I thought I'd test it again. I left the curtains open, curiosity burning in my chest, daring the darkness to prove itself. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of the wind. But then, somewhere past midnight, a low whisper reached my ears, a hushed murmuring, almost like a chant, rising and falling with the rhythm of the trees swaying outside. I got up, heart pounding, and peered out. For a second I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, movement. A shadow darted across the clearing, faster than any animal I knew. I slammed the curtains shut, retreating back to bed, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything at all. Days passed, and I kept the curtains closed without a second thought. But something had changed in the air around the cabin. The forest seemed darker, the shadows longer, and a cold feeling of unease clung to me. One evening, I heard the first scratch, a faint, persistent sound right at the edge of the window by my bed. I tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder, almost like nails dragging across the glass. I lay frozen, staring at the closed curtains, feeling the presence just beyond, waiting for me to look. The scratching stopped suddenly, leaving a silence heavy enough to crush me. I didn't sleep that night. I found myself both terrified and drawn to whatever was out there. Each night, I heard whispers outside, soft and unintelligible, weaving their way into my dreams, always calling me to look. The scratching returned each night, a steady rhythm that seemed to be in sync with my heartbeat, always in the same spot. One morning I found faint scratches on the window frame, like something had tried to pull itself inside. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The temptation to open the curtains grew stronger every night, a nagging curiosity that refused to leave me alone. Desperate for answers, I went back to Miss Ethel. She told me of a legend whispered among the oldest families in the mountains, a story about shadows that lived in the trees, creatures that thrived in the dark, lurking just out of sight. They despised being seen, yet they were drawn to anyone who dared to look at them. Once they know you're curious, they won't stop, she said, her voice trembling. They'll scratch, they'll whisper, they'll wait, and if you look at them long enough, they'll take you. The weight of her words settled over me, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. That night, I felt them more strongly than ever before. The scratching was louder, almost frantic, and the whispers seemed to come from all directions. I closed my eyes, forcing myself not to move, trying to resist the insatiable urge to pull back the curtains. The whispers grew louder, forming words now, fragmented but insistent, urging me to look and see. My hands trembled, inching toward the curtain before I pulled them back, gripping the edge of the bed. I couldn't look. I wouldn't look. But the fear gnawed at me. I knew they were right outside, watching, waiting for the tiniest crack in my resolve. Over the next few days, I barely left the cabin. I felt their presence with me always, lurking just beyond the walls, watching and waiting. The scratches on the window multiplied, a growing web of thin, angry lines. Each night was worse than the last, the voices outside more urgent, the scratching more frenzied. It was as though they knew I was weakening. I felt their shadows seeping through the walls, creeping closer with each passing night. My reflection in the mirror grew hollow, tired, as though a piece of me was slipping away. I couldn't keep this up. Something had to give. On the 7th night, just past midnight, the whispers grew louder than I'd ever heard. They called my name, the sound so familiar it sent a chill through my spine. The scratching grew frantic, almost pleading, as if begging me to open the curtains. Unable to resist, I reached for the edge of the fabric, my fingers trembling. I felt as though I was in a trance, the shadows pulling me in, drawing me closer. But just as my hand began to move, I heard my grandmother's voice, clear and strong in my mind. "Keep the curtains closed." With a jolt, I snapped back, snatching my hand away. The whispers faded, the scratching stopped, and a stillness settled over the cabin, thick and suffocating. I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, as dawn crept over the mountains, bathing the cabin in pale light. That morning, I packed my bags, deciding I could no longer live in the cabin. The whispers, the shadows, whatever they were, they'd claimed enough of my sanity. I boarded up the windows, sealing each one carefully, hoping it would be enough to keep them out. As I locked the door, I could feel them watching, a cold, lingering gaze following me down the path. The mountain air felt heavy with their disappointment, and for the first time, I felt truly free of their pull. I moved away, but the memories never left me. Late at night, I sometimes hear faint whispers, like a breath of wind through the trees, calling me back to the cabin. And every now and then, I find myself fighting the urge to look out the window, afraid of what might be waiting, just beyond the edge of the curtains. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you've heard and want to hear more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate your support.